That'll be relevant in just a couple minutes, I promise. Hi, everyone. I'm Liv Erickson. I am a virtual and augmented reality developer evangelist from a little company you may have heard of called Microsoft. If you want to be inundated with more tweets about virtual reality than you ever thought a single human could produce, this is my Twitter account. I love talking about VR. Just about as much as this picture shows, you can probably guess. I absolutely adore immersive technologies, and I'm really, really excited to be here with you today to share this. So I'm going to jump right into it and start with the big question: why care about virtual reality, and why work on virtual reality? I generally wouldn't give this advice to people. I get asked a lot, what made you get into VR, AR? And I was in the situation where I made my entire life decision on what I wanted to do with my career based off of a YouTube video. Again, not something I generally recommend people do, but I moved out to the San Francisco Bay Area 3 years ago, and I wanted to find a technology that I just wanted to spend all my time doing and loved very passionately. And I saw a video where someone was talking about the Oculus Rift Developer Kit 2, and I was immediately like, yep, that's it. I'm going to just drop everything that I have learned up until this point and do VR. So why VR? It's changing the way that we think about computing, and I'm going to start with this one. It's really, really fun. I was in the situation when I first got out of college that I didn't have this passion for what I was working on. I had a great team. I was kind of like, okay, this is cool. But I never really made this connection that what I should be working on should just be really fun, and I really loved it, and I needed to find something in my life that I found really fun, and virtual reality was one of those things. Having this ability to be transported to an entirely new world elevates storytelling, and as humans, we like telling stories. We like to relate to each other through stories. Having access to an unlimited number of virtual places that basically I create out of something that I think about, and I'm like, yeah, you know what, that sounds really cool, I want to do that. It's opening up this whole new world where we can actually build anything that we think of. This is a picture from my very first virtual reality experience that I ever did. I spent my entire life loving Star Wars. Any other Star Wars fans in the audience? I'm pretty sure I can't be the only one. Yeah, okay. So my very first VR experience was living out a dream that I had had since I was 5 years old in getting to do a lightsaber training demo that was the same thing that Luke did when he got onto the Millennium Falcon in the first movie. And that was really kind of eye-opening for me. It was experiencing this technology and realizing that it had the potential to help me live out this kind of fantasy world dream that I had never thought would be something I could physically do. Virtual reality is changing the way that we relate to each other. That talk on empathy was absolutely amazing, and it really hits home a lot of these points that we are constantly seeking out new ways to relate to each other. So this is a picture from when I went and visited my parents. These are my parents. They're being featured prominently here. I took that with this camera that you just saw me kind of hide behind the podium and take earlier, because my sister is missing from this picture. I went back home to visit them, but she wasn't able to take off work. And with kind of this immersive technology that's developing in this ecosystem, I was able to take this picture that I can stick into a headset, and it's like I can go back to that place in time, and I can remember exactly where I was, what that felt like, and I can have other people experience that very specific part of my life that's very important to me. For all of you, I just took a picture standing on stage behind the podium because I'm nervous, and I know that when I talk to people after I give talks, some of them are, oh, I would love to speak, but I don't know what it's like. And we now have the technology where you can see exactly what it's like to be standing in my footsteps right here on stage at this very moment. And in the future, I get to come back and revisit that too, which I find fascinating. And it's changing how we relate to technology. I love this picture. I love this picture for a lot of different reasons, but what I love about it is that it really captures this idea of thinking about robots in this case, but technology in general, in new ways that are more human. They're more personal. We're able to start thinking about devices and how they play into our lives on a very new level that we haven't quite had before. Almost everyone in this room, if not everyone, has a device that they're carrying around that connects them to the people they love, the information that's important to them. And virtual reality starts to elevate that when you can stand inside rooms and interact with data in ways that are more realistic, more like the world that we're used to experiencing. Compared to more traditional computing platforms, VR has benefits around fundamentally changing that way that we interact with technology. So you'll see in a few minutes an example of a demo that I've built that takes Excel data and graphs it in 3D. For me, I love technology, but I have a really hard time looking and remembering charts and being like, okay, I know that was telling me something important, but what was that? And when you start to think about data in ways that relate it back to what you're experiencing, something like the price of something in stacks of dollar bills becomes a lot more memorable than if you simply saw a number and started to try to remember what that meant, because we're spatial creatures. We interact with things in 3D all the time. That's how our world works as we know it. So before we even dive into the VR web, I want to start with just going over what the VR ecosystem today looks like. So first we have probably the most common mobile VR device type available, and this is powered by a smartphone. It's a device that is essentially allowing your server or your phone to serve as the processor and display for a VR device. Do any of you have a mobile VR device? A few of you. Oh, good. Okay, that's good. That every time I ask that question at a talk, that number goes up, which makes me personally really excited because I feel like I'm doing the right kind of talk for kind of how the industry is growing and evolving. So mobile VR, like I mentioned, allows your phone to serve as the primary processor behind all of these applications, and the applications you're running are just generally simple smartphone applications. You have a number of internal sensors that are measuring rotation and head orientation, so it's tracking kind of where you're moving, feels very natural, and updates the screen accordingly, but it tends to be a less powerful or immersive experience than what you're capable of running in something like a desktop VR device. With desktop VR devices, you're generally running standard PC applications. Your head-mounted display is entirely separate. You're not powering this from the device itself. You're powering it from an external computer, which generally means that you're tethered in. You still have a number of those sensors that are measuring the head tracking, the orientation of your head and where you're looking, but you also have a number of other potential devices, like seen here. You could have hand-tracked controllers. You could have full room scale tracking systems that are watching where you're moving around. So if I move over here, it'll know that. And you end up with a more powerful experience, but again, at the expense that you're tethered to a desktop. Lastly, and this is very, very kind of like broadly separating VR devices into these three categories, and this is changing almost monthly now. But if I went through and listed everyone, we'd go way past 30 minutes, and there's a lot more interesting stuff to talk about. The last one is standalone devices, and these are devices that are all-in-ones. Everything is contained. In this case, the headset and the controller, but also sometimes just in a headset itself. They can be mobile or desktop operating system based. They may be hybrid devices. In the example of this headset, you can actually take the controller away, which is where all of the processing is done, and plug it into a desktop, so you have a different model. But what you're starting to see here in the industry is that new devices are coming out and playing and pushing the boundaries of what's possible with immersive technologies today. And if you haven't had a chance to try any of those, find me tomorrow because I'll have my Gear VR with me, and I'm more than happy to do demos. I love showing people VR stuff for the first time. So why think about the browser as a platform for virtual reality experiences in the future? Right now, we're still at a relatively early stage for this wave of VR. It's come around a couple of times in the past. It never really landed, but we're starting to see this resurgence of the technology because we finally are at a position where we have developer conferences like this to get developers excited about building applications for immersive technology. We're a lot more comfortable with technology and putting stuff on our faces and running around with goggles on, and we haven't really reached a point yet where there are best practices that are defined or set standards, which makes it a really fun and interesting time to just get in and start experimenting. So when you're considering all of this, the browser as a platform for virtual reality becomes really interesting. A lot of the things that make the browser a really good option for a lot of applications today are also paralleled when building for VR. You have the ability to build an app and not have to think about what it's running on. That's a very, very generalized statement because, of course, at this stage, you have to think about kind of what you're running on from a design perspective and feature implementation. But the benefit of the virtual reality web is that you can have an application and start building out that experience that will work regardless of the device that you're using it on, or if you're even using a VR device at all. This is really good when you're kind of starting out with VR development because it allows you to focus on the content rather than learning kind of the ins and outs of one particular platform, because as I just mentioned, there's a huge number of those and it's changing almost monthly at this point. You have open access to content, which is really critical for virtual reality experiences because we haven't really figured out how to define them yet. In a situation where you have maybe a 3-minute experience in VR that captures very specific content, like one, maybe a festival experience, is that an app? Is that a smaller piece of consumable content? Is that a news story? And when you are building these out to run natively and you're going through an app store, you're at someone else's ability to decide whether or not it's a game or if it's an article and whether or not it's a big enough scope to put on the app store. So when you think about the web as a content platform for virtual reality, you have a lot more flexibility over that control and what experiences you're able to distribute. You're letting the browser do a lot of the work. We'll get into the specifics about the WebVR API in just a second, but at its core, looking at the browser as a VR platform allows you to let the browser take care of a lot of things that individual SDKs would otherwise that you would have to be implementing separately in your application. So one of these benefits is that you are able to look at cross-platform development and say, I don't even want to think about whether or not I'm running on a desktop with an Oculus Rift or a mobile phone with the browser in a cardboard headset. I just want it to work. And I want it to look good if you're not running VR headsets at all. And you lastly, which I like in terms of developing for VR, you get to bring your favorite web technologies with you. It's JavaScript, rendering all of this in a WebGL context. You can build on top of your favorite sites, your favorite technologies. You can add this to things that already exist because of that framework, and those that potential for adding that layer of 3D graphics lets you really build some really cool stuff with all of the things that already exist in the JavaScript ecosystem. So when you start to look at building the VR web, the elements of today's ecosystem, it's not just one specific platform, one specific framework, though it does generally share that core around the WebVR API. However, there's a lot of flexibility in how you can start building virtual reality web applications today. So at the very top level, we're going to look at 3D JavaScript libraries, because these are what's going to make up the majority of what someone will see in your application. So one of the first considerations is, how am I going to build this environment? What do I want people to be inside of and experiencing when I'm building an application? JavaScript libraries like Three.js and Babylon provide these ecosystems to build out 3D applications so that you don't have to write a raycaster or shaders yourself, or even go through and worry about writing and defining objects and primitives. These libraries kind of take that off so you can think about, okay, what is it exactly that I'm building and how do I have those tools to do that? And both of these libraries have support for WebVR today. So when we look into the WebVR API, it's an experimental API for browsers that allows the browser to handle all of those interactions with VR hardware. So it identifies connected peripherals that you may have. So in the case of, say, a Vive room scale system, it identifies that you are in a room that's tracking VR, and you as a developer just kind of have access to that. You don't have to worry about doing different checks of what type of device am I running? Is it actually connected at all? Is this a mobile phone that's running in a headset? The browser does all of that, and it then passes in that display data so that a camera in your scene can just update seamlessly with whatever is happening on the device, and you don't have to worry about interacting with the hardware. Right now, the WebVR API is supported in Firefox Nightly and Chromium with paths to both of those browsers longer term. Under the hood, in the WebVR API, it breaks down virtual reality devices into different components so that you can access the different parts of the hardware. Some of the interfaces are related specifically to rendering a VR scene appropriately for different headsets, while others will handle things like the orientation, the extensibility to provide additional services, like with Gamepad or audio. And for a VR device, you may see things that are completely separate from the headset itself, like additional tracking cameras or controllers. For a mobile phone, it may just be kind of making up that this exists and getting those capabilities to provide the implementation itself. So under the hood, you're looking at the base of all VR devices, which is a VR display, whether or not that's all contained in one package or if it's in a number of different devices. The API will recognize these devices and pass those on and say, hey, you have this plugged in, you can use this. At any given time, the state of the headset will be saved in the VR pose, so it will know the difference if I'm looking here as a pose versus if I'm looking there as a different pose, and all of that transitional data in between gets handed off to the application to use. In the situation where you are, say, running a full room scale VR experience, you'll also have the stage parameters, which will tell the browser application you have X amount of space to move before you will hit the boundaries of this. And as I mentioned, extensions for a lot of other interfaces are also provided. And if you're interested, you can go right there and learn more. So when you look at the kind of overarching libraries in developing for WebVR, it reuses a lot of libraries, as I mentioned, that regular 2D display 3D applications will use with Three.js, Babylon. And there's a few libraries that sit on top of that, and essentially we'll just pipe in a camera update and provide all of the additional functionality of having that headset on. The WebVR framework contains 3 major components for working with browsers that have desktop headsets plugged in, and then a polyfill that fills in all the rest when you're on a mobile device. So the VR controls apply the headset transforms to a scene camera. The VR effect is going to calculate and tell your application how it should render your application depending on the screen size, the pixel density resolution, which changes from device to device, especially when you look at mobile VR. And then the WebVR manager handles moving in and out of WebVR and non-WebVR mode, which I'll show in just a second. But of course, there's always more. There's actually a pretty rich ecosystem being built on top of the WebVR libraries that make it even easier to develop if you're just starting out for virtual reality applications. And these are generally wrappers around the JavaScript implementation of the WebVR API that you can use if you maybe prefer markup styled languages like A-Frame and visual programming systems like Visor Create. These are options that are available to let you kind of program right in your browser and experiment with different scenes, different kind of technologies to figure out what works best for your specific experience. And they just provide a couple of options, because who doesn't like options for development? If you are familiar with game programming and game development, there's also the ability now with the Unity game engine to build an application and export it directly to a WebGL WebVR scene. This lets you use JavaScript, C#, Boo, to write scripts in the Unity game engine. You add in a plugin that says, I'm going to export this to the web, and I want it to support VR. And then all of the desktop browsers that support WebVR will also let you do that in the application. And I'll have a video of this in just a second. Because that's enough talking. You probably want to start seeing this in action. As a heads up, these are some videos that I have taken from inside a VR headset. So if you're very, very prone to motion sickness, it may get a little wobbly at times on the screen, just as a heads up for that. So the first thing that I'm going to show you is a video of the application that I was talking about earlier. And this is a way of taking a traditional data set that you have and looking at it in an entirely different way. So I'm going to go ahead, and this was shot on a mobile phone. You can see when I'm starting out, it's just a regular website. You don't have to be in VR mode for it. And I'm going to go ahead and see if I can play that. There. So this is just using a Bootstrap template to kind of render everything, because you want to just be able to kind of have those experiences that users are familiar with. And then it loads in a WebVR scene that's rendering this graph that I took from the Excel data and putting it into 3D. When I switched it into VR mode, it starts rendering stereoscopically side by side, so that if I was wearing this on my head, it would now be rendering appropriately for my eyes. And I can look around and I can see this, and it's a little bit hard to tell on a video screen, kind of, because this screen itself is very large. But for me, being able to kind of stand inside of this graph and see things like, oh yeah, the cost of living in San Francisco is very, very large. And instead of having this kind of arbitrary scale, these are in units of me. Like I'm standing there and I can look up and see 700 Livies standing there for comparative kind of analysis of the cost of living. So this next sample that I built here is using A-Frame, which is, as I kind of rushed through a little bit earlier there, a markup-styled language from Moz VR's team, where you can essentially use markup to wrap around Three.js objects and create virtual reality scenes. This is a live link, so if we want to test out the conference Wi-Fi here and you want to see for yourself what this looks like on a mobile device, you can go there. I, as you can see, love my little 360 camera. And I'm going to actually go ahead and switch over to this scene live so you can get a sense of what it looks like on the desktop browser. But up here in the corner, you can see that's what it looks like on a mobile phone, very similar to the application that I just showed you, because again, it's using all of the same underlying frameworks there. But I've built this scene out based on some pictures that I've taken from this trip already. I've showed this before, or a rough kind of similar version of this application, but the cool thing about A-Frame is that this takes 17 lines of code. This is the entire website that you just saw, excluding that one script source, so I'm cheating a little bit there. But if we go ahead over and switch into the browser here, I don't have a desktop VR device plugged in because I don't have a desktop with me, and that's not showing, so let me switch that over real quick. I apologize if I break the projection system for like all the other stuff. So you can see here that I've actually got this scene that's showing a 360 video or picture that I took at the Blue Lagoon on Tuesday. So I can look around with this. Since I'm not using a VR device, I can use my mouse to just kind of click and drag. And this renders the way it would in any browser. And it's not in VR mode because the browser is detecting I don't have anything plugged in. If I did, I have this little button down here, and it's not going to let me click on it because I don't have a headset plugged in. But if we switch back over to the slides, and I'll see if I can get this. You get a sneak preview of the next slide here. Oh, no. Let's see. Well, you know what? I'll just keep. Whoop. This is what happens when you try to show the live demos. Cool. Well, we'll just duplicate it, and you can go through the rest of my slides with me. Perfect. All right. So you can see that that's handling all of the code that I didn't have, like all of the web VR switching and everything like that. Really powerful framework there. This video here is what I was mentioning earlier with the export from the Unity engine into a web VR site. So I'm going to go ahead and just click on this real quick to show you that this is sitting in a WebGL canvas. And I've recorded this for my desktop using my Oculus Rift. So I put this on, I'm looking around in my headset, it's tracking all of that and passing that into the WebGL context, and I don't really have to do anything specific to say I wanted this to work on the browser. It's the similar export function that I could have used if I was building it to a desktop application, but I was able to just say, I'm gonna stick this in a website and go with it. So I'm gonna switch back to this real quick, because I think that this kind of starts to show a lot of where browser-based VR will make the most sense kind of in the short term. And that's in that right now, not everybody does have a VR device. You need to start thinking about these experiences in a very hybrid sort of way, which is hard to do if you're building native applications for VR. Either they're in the VR app or they're not. But when you start to think about the web as a platform for VR, you have a lot more flexibility with how you're able to build out these experiences to work in that kind of hybrid model. You know, sometimes we do have our phones and we want to do, you know, we want to have that flexibility of looking around with the phone and put that in the headset real quick. You can imagine if you were shopping for something online, maybe new furniture, and you wanted to say, you know, oh, that looks really cool, but how big is it really? And you can put that headset on super fast, see the size of the furniture, the color of different like maybe you want a dress and you want to see what that color of the dress is. And you have that ability to kind of look in this experience and be navigating through and working with stuff in a very seamless way. So looking ahead, and thinking about kind of what the future of VR in the browser looks like. These are all things that are evolving really, really rapidly over the coming years as VR is becoming more and more widely adopted. Over 5 million cardboard units were shipped as of January this year, and that was, 9 months ago almost. And the market is like regularly making improvements. New devices are being announced. Support for browser-based VR for these devices are being announced just yesterday, actually. The open source VR headset and the developer kits have released their support for the browser-based VR. And because of the way the kind of virtual and augmented reality are blending together, even at this early stage, there are custom browsers within virtual reality applications that are starting to add support for holographic content. So you can almost have like a augmented or mixed reality scene inside of a virtual reality application based on WebVR. So you can write a WebVR site, view it in VR, and then have that come to life within another virtual environment. And you start to get at a very Inception level kind of thing. And we're really at the beginning. Like, the potential with all of the different smart and connected devices we have around the Internet of Things, around biometric devices, big data, machine learning, starting to bring all of the tools that the web has kind of been evolving over the past several decades into immersive content, brings with it a lot of capabilities and a lot of potential for very, very interesting applications in the future. Of course, there are always challenges with things like this. Bringing browser performance with 3D content on par with native applications around frame rate, latency, it's a little bit of a challenge, but I've seen some really compelling examples of people hitting 90 frames per second in some of these experimental browsers and custom builds of development browsers. So we're getting there, and it's definitely something that's going to be feasible when you start looking at different types of applications. And of course, the content that you're building is going to depend a lot on the requirements for your performance. In the first example, if you're building an Excel chart, and you're viewing an Excel chart without a lot of heavy animations, that's going to be a lot different performance-wise in the browser than something like a full 3D, 360-degree game that you're watching and playing with. Cross-platform design experimentation, as I mentioned, right now, a lot of the considerations around building a web VR site come less around technical decisions that you may have to make, but more around the design considerations. If you're wearing a headset with a phone in it, you're going to have a different number of, interactions that are available to you than if you're using something like the Vive, where you have a full room and you have hand controllers. And then lastly, getting really rich visual editing tools in 3D for building 3D experiences in the browser is something that is also, again, kind of being worked on right now, but it's at early stages. It's really challenging sometimes to write things and knowing kind of what the 3D coordinate system in the headset's going to look like if I'm writing that all in text. So if I know, the z-axis could be in front or behind me, where do I put things if I can't see them relative to one another? Having those visual editing tools makes a lot of sense. But we're starting to see more and more opportunities where you don't just have visual editing tools on the monitor in front of you, but you also get them inside of a virtual application yourself. So you can sit there and code and see these objects appearing next to you as you're writing them. So with that, I want everyone to go build something awesome, and there's so much that is out there right now around the ecosystem. If you want to learn more, I have a GitHub repository where I've been collecting basically all of the resources I can find about learning virtual reality development in general, design, the different options that you have. I love, like I said, tweeting and talking about VR, so if you have questions, you can tweet at me, or you can find me. I'll be around here the next 2 days. Love to talk to you more about all of this. And with that, I hope you're kind of getting excited about immersive content, because right now, the way that we interact with a single screen or multiple screens is fundamentally going to be different how we interact when our entire world and our entire environment can be manipulated and changed, and we could have screens all over the place, or virtual things that are sitting on stage to talk to you about things and demoing things with you. So with that, I want to thank you so much for having me out here, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your time.